Before we begin, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because the story you're about to hear isn't just history. It's one of the most chilling disasters ever recorded at sea. A night when arrogance, secrets, and human decisions turned a luxury voyage into a floating crime scene. The North Atlantic was silent that night, April 14, 1912. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, black and glassy under a sky filled with cold, distant stars. The air carried a bitter chill that crept into bones. There were no waves, no wind, just a strange, unnatural calm. And cutting through that darkness was the largest ship the world had ever seen, the RMS Titanic. To the thousands aboard her, the ship represented triumph, the height of human engineering, a floating palace traveling from Southampton to New York City, marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, dining rooms that looked like royal courts. Passengers believed they were sailing on something unstoppable. Newspapers had already given the ship a nickname, Unsinkable. But shortly before midnight, something went terribly wrong. High above the deck, inside the crow's nest, lookout Frederick Fleet strained his eyes against the dark horizon. The sea was unusually calm. Too calm. Normally, waves would crash against floating ice, making it easier to spot. But tonight, the ocean was flat as polished glass. Then suddenly, something appeared. A dark shape, straight ahead. Fleet's heart slammed against his chest. Iceberg, right ahead! The warning bell rang 3 times, the emergency signal. Inside the bridge, officers reacted instantly. The command was shouted, "Hard a starboard!" Engines reversed. But physics doesn't negotiate with panic. The Titanic was over 46,000 tons of steel moving through icy water at nearly 22 knots. The ship turned, but not fast enough. Passengers barely noticed the impact. Instead of a violent crash, there was only a long, grinding shudder along the hull, like a giant dragging its fingernails across metal. Then, silence. In first class, people continued drinking champagne. A few curious guests stepped onto the deck, looking for the iceberg they had heard about. Some even laughed. Chunks of ice had landed on the deck, sparkling under electric lights. It felt harmless, almost amusing. But deep below the luxury suites, far beneath the polished floors and elegant carpets, something catastrophic had happened. The iceberg had ripped open the ship's starboard side. 6 watertight compartments were flooding. The Titanic had been designed to survive 4. Water poured inside the ship like a slow, unstoppable execution. In the engine rooms, workers stared in disbelief as freezing seawater surged through the steel corridors. Engineers rushed to contain the flooding, slamming watertight doors shut. But it was already too late. Within minutes, Captain Edward Smith was called to the bridge. Ship designer Thomas Andrews studied the damage reports carefully. His face turned pale as he calculated the numbers. The silence in the room was unbearable. Finally, Andrews looked at the captain and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. "She will sink. Not might, not possibly, will." The estimate was terrifying. The Titanic had maybe 2 hours. 2 hours before the greatest ship ever built would disappear beneath the Atlantic. Above deck, passengers were still unaware of the danger. The band continued playing music. Waiters continued serving drinks. But crew members were already preparing lifeboats. And that's when the second horrifying truth emerged. There weren't enough. The Titanic carried over 2,200 people, but there were only lifeboats for about half. It wasn't an accident. When the ship was designed, lifeboats were seen as unnecessary clutter on luxury liners. Regulations at the time required only a limited number based on ship weight, not passenger capacity. Shipbuilders believed the Titanic itself was the lifeboat. Now the reality was undeniable. More than 1,000 people would have no escape. At 12:15 a.m., the first distress signals were sent into the night. Wireless operators tapped desperately on their telegraph keys. CQD. Then the newer signal, SOS. Nearby ships received the message, but the closest vessel, the Californian, sat surrounded by ice fields. Its wireless operator had already gone to sleep. The Titanic was alone. Meanwhile, lifeboats were being lowered into the water, but something strange happened. The first boats left half empty. Passengers didn't believe the ship was in real danger. Some refused to board the small wooden boats, preferring the warmth and safety of the massive liner. Crew members tried to enforce the rule, women and children first. But confusion spread quickly. Arguments broke out. Fear started to creep into conversations. And far below deck, third-class passengers faced another problem: locked gates, barriers designed to separate social classes. Some families struggled desperately through the maze of corridors, trying to reach the upper decks. Others never made it out. As the bow of the Titanic slowly dipped lower into the freezing Atlantic, the reality finally hit everyone. The ship wasn't unsinkable. It was dying. Cold wind whipped across the deck as lifeboats began filling faster. Officers fired warning shots into the air to control the growing panic. Children cried. Couples held each other tightly. Some passengers prayed. Others stood frozen in shock. And still, the band continued playing music drifting into the icy night while the ship slowly tilted towards its fate. But what investigators would later uncover made the disaster even more disturbing. Because long before the Iceberg appeared, there had been warnings. Multiple ice warnings from nearby ships, messages that never reached the bridge, messages that were ignored or possibly buried beneath something else. When rescue ships finally arrived hours later, more than 1,500 people would be gone, swallowed in freezing water in one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. But as investigators would later examine the timeline, witness statements, and radio logs, a chilling question began to surface. Was the Titanic simply the victim of bad luck, or had a chain of dangerous decisions sealed the fate of everyone on board? Because one final message received that night revealed something investigators couldn't ignore: a warning about massive ice fields directly in Titanic's path, a warning that arrived less than an hour before the collision, and somehow it never reached the captain. Before we dive back into the horror of the Titanic, take a moment, smash that subscribe button, hit like if you're ready for the darkest truths, and comment below if you've ever wondered how luxury and greed can become a death sentence. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of one of history's most infamous disasters, and what lies beneath is far darker than most realize. The first rays of dawn struggled to pierce the icy horizon. Survivors huddled together on lifeboats, teeth chattering, eyes wide, watching as the Titanic's massive silhouette disappeared slowly into the dark waters. Smoke and steam rose from the chimneys, remnants of fire still smoldering deep in the engines. Yet, amidst the chaos, investigators and historians would later discover that the disaster wasn't just an accident of nature. It was a complex web of negligence, human error, and perhaps even corruption. Captain Edward Smith's final hours on the bridge became the subject of intense scrutiny. Crew testimonies described a man torn between pride, fear, and duty. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, had walked the decks tirelessly, urging passengers into lifeboats and confronting officers with the reality that the vessel's supposedly unsinkable design had catastrophic flaws. Rivets along the hull had popped under the iceberg's impact. Compartments meant to stay watertight failed one after another. It was mechanical failure, yes, but human oversight amplified the tragedy. Then came the wireless messages, hundreds of them. CQD, SOS, repeated calls for help that bounced off the walls of the Titanic's technology and missed the ears that could have saved lives. Logs from the Californian, just miles away, revealed that its operator had gone off duty, leaving distress signals unanswered. And beyond that, a shadow of suspicion lingered. Some communications never made it to the bridge at all. Were they misplaced, ignored, or deliberately suppressed? Amidst survivors, stories emerged that hinted at more than just panic and heroism. Some first-class passengers were reported to have bribed crew members to secure seats in lifeboats. Others spoke of men disguising themselves as women to escape. The lifeboats meant to save became scenes of betrayal, desperation, and stark inequality. Meanwhile, third-class passengers were blocked by locked gates and labyrinthine corridors, left to navigate the sinking ship alone. Every corridor, every staircase became a potential death trap. Investigators later focused on the crew's chain of command. Why had so many ignored iceberg warnings? Testimonies indicated conflicting orders, miscommunications, and even dismissive attitudes towards the risks. Some officers were rumored to have been complacent, believing their ship truly could not sink. Others, perhaps in fear of undermining authority or reputation, failed to act decisively. In hindsight, it appeared that the iceberg was only part of the story. Human negligence was equally deadly. But then, something even more disturbing surfaced. Among the recovered logs and personal notes, the implication was horrifying. If the ship sank, lives would be lost. But if the company's reputation survived, the financial damage would be mitigated. Some historians called it a tragic lesson in capitalism gone wrong. Others whispered that it bordered on criminal negligence. And as the ocean claimed more of Titanic's secrets, the story became darker still. Whispers of bribery, falsified inspection records, and ignored engineering warnings. Even today, over a century later, forensic dives to the wreck reveal the lasting consequences of human misjudgment. The ship's fractured hull, twisted metal, and scattered artifacts serve as a chilling reminder. Disasters are rarely only natural. Often, they are crimes of oversight, arrogance, and greed. Every rivet that failed, every ignored warning, every locked door contributed to what was effectively a preventable massacre. And just when investigators thought they understood the full scope of the tragedy, a final piece of evidence surfaced that no one expected. Among recovered personal belongings was a small, locked case belonging to a first-class passenger. Inside were documents, travel plans, and a map marked with locations of emergency supplies that were intentionally misallocated. It suggested deliberate prioritization, a choice that would have condemned hundreds. The questions multiplied. Who had made those decisions? Were they merely following orders, or was there something darker at play? Why had so many ignored life-saving protocols? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, had the Titanic truly been unsinkable, or was it doomed the moment it left port? As the Atlantic claimed the last remnants of the ship and the bodies of the passengers drifted into freezing darkness, the world began to ask these questions. The investigation into the Titanic's sinking revealed layers of mystery, human error, and potential corruption that would haunt maritime history forever. But just when it seemed the answers were within reach, a shocking revelation emerged from the recovered bridge logs. Hidden beneath layers of official notes was a single cryptic entry, a warning sent by an unknown crew member, marked in haste, never delivered to Captain Smith. It suggested that someone on board knew more about the iceberg threat than anyone had realized. And the name signed at the bottom of that note? A senior officer who had vanished in the chaos, never to be found. The shadow of betrayal stretched across the Atlantic. The investigation had only just begun. Before we enter the final chilling chapter, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a story of greed, deception, and human choices that cost over 1,500 lives. And when it ends, you'll never look at the word unsinkable the same way again. The Atlantic remained merciless. Weeks after the Titanic vanished beneath the icy waves, investigators and journalists combed through survivor accounts, crew testimonies, and the fragile remnants of the ship's logs. It quickly became clear the iceberg was only the tip of a far more sinister iceberg of human decisions. Survivors spoke of unusual behaviors among the officers during the early hours. First-class passengers described certain crew members moving quickly to reserve lifeboats for their own acquaintances, whispering urgent instructions, and even hiding key safety equipment. Others recalled seeing stewards removing life jackets from some areas while leaving extras in the cabins of wealthier travelers. Each testimony added a new layer of suspicion, and investigators could not ignore the pattern. Meanwhile, the recovery of the Titanic's bridge logs and wireless messages revealed inconsistencies that sent shockwaves through the maritime community. One undelivered ice warning, sent from a nearby ship, contained precise coordinates of the massive ice field directly in Titanic's path. Normally, such a warning would have reached the captain immediately, but the log showed it had been intercepted. The sender's identity later traced to a communications officer who disappeared during the chaos. The question hung in the air. Had someone deliberately suppressed information that could have prevented the disaster? Investigators delved deeper. Letters recovered from shipping company archives revealed financial motives. The Titanic was insured for an astronomical sum, and while insurance was standard, the documents hinted at bonuses tied to demonstrating operational confidence in the ship's seaworthiness. Some historians argued this was a euphemism for ignoring safety risks, a cold corporate calculation that placed money above lives. Among the chilling stories were accounts from crew members themselves. One steward, speaking anonymously decades later, described finding a first-class passenger's locked case tucked away in a storage compartment. Inside were directives from the company: prioritize the lives of wealthier passengers, ensure lifeboat capacity favors first class, and avoid panic that might damage the brand. These instructions, he claimed, were handed down days before the ship even left port. And then came the most disturbing revelation. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, had secretly objected to some modifications made by White Star executives. He had warned the captain and senior officers that the ship could sink under certain circumstances. His warnings were documented in private correspondences, but they had been ignored. Andrews had remained on the ship until the end, directing passengers to safety, fully aware that the tragedy might be unavoidable. Investigators also uncovered testimony from survivors about suspicious behaviors among certain first-class passengers. Several accounts described groups that moved quickly to secure lifeboats, bypassing rules, and even arguing with crew to force spots. Some letters later revealed these passengers had known connections to shipping executives and may have been tipped about the ship's vulnerabilities in advance. A small circle of influence, it seemed, had leveraged foreknowledge while thousands perished. The pattern of negligence and deliberate misdirection painted a grim picture. The Titanic disaster wasn't just an accident of nature, it was a convergence of human errors, corporate greed, and betrayals at multiple levels. Families of third-class passengers were left trapped by locked gates and confusing corridors. Crew members struggled to maintain order, while under unspoken pressure to comply with directives that favored the wealthy. Panic wasn't just natural, it was engineered by a system that decided some lives mattered more than others. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. Months after the sinking, a small, water-damaged journal was recovered from the wreckage. The handwriting, though blurred by salt and time, matched that of a senior officer who had vanished in the chaos. Inside were entries detailing secret meetings, corporate directives, and even instructions to suppress lifeboat allocations. One line, scrawled in desperation, read, "If this ship survives the night, the world will never know what we almost lost and who was sacrificed." The discovery sent investigators into disbelief. The officer had not merely followed orders, he had been complicit in shaping who would live and who would die. The Iceberg had been merciless, but human hands had ensured the scale of the tragedy. Historians piecing together the evidence realized the truth was more harrowing than the legend. The Titanic wasn't just a victim of icy waters, it was a crime of oversight, of greed, and of betrayal. Families who lost loved ones were victims not only of nature's cruelty, but of deliberate human decisions. The unsinkable ship had become a stage for corporate and social hierarchies to dictate mortality itself. The Atlantic kept its secrets. The wreck, lying in darkness more than 12,000 feet below, held thousands of untold stories, personal items, letters, and artifacts that would never tell their full tale. But the recovered evidence exposed a truth that would haunt generations. The Titanic sank not solely because of an iceberg, but because humans failed in ways both tragic and criminal. And yet the final twist came decades later. Forensic analysis of the wreck showed an anomaly in the steel plates along the hull, evidence of a previous collision that had weakened the ship days before the fatal night. Combined with the suppression of ice warnings and deliberate prioritization of certain passengers, the sinking now read like a crime scene, a preventable disaster, with fingerprints of human negligence at every turn. As history reflects on the Titanic, one lesson stands out. The greatest danger often comes not from nature, but from human choices. Pride, arrogance, and greed carved a path to death across the Atlantic, leaving over 1,500 lives in its wake. The story is a grim reminder that disasters are rarely only accidental, and when negligence is layered with malice or self-interest, history remembers the dead long after the waters have claimed them. The Titanic's legacy is more than a tale of a ship sinking. It's a story of betrayal, cover-ups, and the devastating cost of ignoring warnings. It's proof that sometimes the deadliest crimes are committed not with weapons, but with indifference and poor judgment. If you think this story was intense, imagine standing on deck that night, watching the largest ship ever built crumble under your feet, knowing that some deaths could have been prevented. The unsinkable ship sank, but the truth, dark, haunting, and human, refuses to stay buried.